Nehemiah chapter 5, verse 1. I'm thankful for Greg last week for preaching for me about the opposition that we were facing. But one of the things that I want to go into today, and we're going to see a little bit of difference in chapter 5 than chapter 4. And I think Aaliyah hit it on the head when she was playing piano, that there are some things that we would consider sin, outwardly attacking people, our anger, our pride. But sometimes what we don't necessarily think of as sin is opportunism. You know, we sometimes can look at opportunism as a way of good business or taking advantage, but just the world and the way that we live. And I feel like what we're going to see in Nehemiah chapter 5 is kind of a fighting of that. Chapter 5, verse 1, "Now there arose a great outcry of the people and of their wives against their Jewish brothers. For there were those who said, with our sons and our daughters we are many, so let us get grain that we may eat and keep alive. And there also were those who said, we are mortgaging our fields and our vineyards and our houses to get grain because of this famine. And there were those who said, we have borrowed money for the king's tax on our fields and our vineyards." Listen to this. "Now our flesh is as the flesh of our brothers, and our children are as their children. Yet we are forcing our sons and our daughters to be slaves, and some of our daughters have already been enslaved, but it is not in our power to help it, for other men have our field and our vineyards." You see, so far in the book of Nehemiah, especially last week, we see Nehemiah facing opposition, but that opposition was coming from the outside, from Sanballat and Tobiah. You see, the opposition we saw last week was exterior. They were attacking the people of Israel, but ultimately what we see today isn't attacks from Sanballat and Tobiah, people outside the walls looking to attack them, but they faced opposition from their own people, from their own brothers and sisters. You see, they may no longer be in captivity in Persia, but they find themselves progressing towards the captivity of a hopeless situation. You know, when I was preparing this, I was trying to think of an example that maybe could resonate with us Wilmingtonians. You see, my wife and I are not from Wilmington. I think everybody gets that by now. We're not from here. This is new to us. But where we lived before in Florence, Kentucky, something magical happened. And I want to say this, and I know that I talk about Kentucky like it's the promised land because it kind of is. That's where my restaurants are. That's where my team is. But something magical happened when we lived in Florence, Kentucky. You see, while we were living there, this is going to sound crazy, I would have to drive 20 miles. And guess how long it took me? About 20 minutes. Oh, it was fantastic. I would leave the house, I would go to work. That was about 10 miles away. And even with the lights, it would take me about 10 to 15 minutes to get there. We moved to Wilmington and we thought, you know what, we could really live anywhere in Wilmington. It's not that big of a town. But what we found out very quickly is that if you are driving 10 miles in Wilmington, it could take you about half the day. You might need to find lodging somewhere in between. So I have been frustrated lately. My nephew's birthday party was the other day, and my wife wanted me to go pick up cookies for his birthday. So from where we live in Ogden, I drove down near the college to this cookie place that we know well, and then I went and took those cookies to my nephew who lived up in Hampstead. It took me forever, and I was frustrated the entire trip. Now let's imagine for a second that I got so frustrated by this that I got in front of the people of Wilmington, North Carolina, and I said, we have to do something about this right now. So everybody needs to call off work, and we're all going to meet over at the bypass, 125,000 people working on the bypass together, just the ground in front of their feet, and we are going to turn this into a road so that we can cut down on traffic. That may be a happy day, but understand something, there would probably be consequences from that, right? Why? Because all of those people probably would have to call off work. And if they called off work, they wouldn't be getting paid for that day. And when they went to the grocery store with the little money that they had, guess what? All of the grocers have called off work. So the stores might not be stocked. Honestly, even if we cut down on traffic in Wilmington, North Carolina, it could have ripple effects that would affect the people of the city. What does that have to do with what we're talking about today? Well, this is, in a much grander scale, the issue that the people of Israel are facing. Why do I say that? You see, even though the Jews had been back in Jerusalem for nearly a century, the infrastructure was not sufficient to support the growing population. Why do I say that? Because the people that were living in Jerusalem were being oppressed. They were struggling. So when Nehemiah came in and all of the Jewish people congregated back into the city, there were problems. Not only that, you see, the needs of the people were made worse by a recent famine. And then because of the workers working on the wall, there were not as many laborers working in the fields. And on top of all of that, the heavy taxes the people were required to pay were crippling them. Now, I could say that those 4 things would be bad enough. Those 4 things would make life super difficult. If just these things would be enough, now let's add on to it one more time. We see that the leaders were taking advantage of the people for selfish benefit rather than helping those in need. I want to be clear here. The inner entrepreneur in us will be at odds with what we're about to read today. That inner part of us that wants to look for a deal, wants to look for an opportunity to push ourselves ahead a little bit, might feel like it's at odds here. That's not what we want to do. But what were these people doing? Well, this verse tells us they were buying land for a cheap price. Legally. There was people in a desperate situation, and some people saw that as an opportunity to buy their land for cheap. But understand something, they were doing it legally. And they were getting labor for much cheaper. We see them saying that they're selling their family members into slavery a lot cheaper. But understand something, the people that were doing this were doing it legally. So understand something, we see this city in a situation where their brothers and sisters are taking advantage of each other, but they're doing it in a very legal, appropriate way. So how do you think Nehemiah responded to this hopeless and desperate situation? Well, we see in verse 6, I was angry when I heard their outcry in these words, and I took counsel with myself, and I brought charges against these nobles and officials. And I said to them, you are exacting interest each from his brother. And I held a great assembly against them and said to them, we, as far as we are able, have brought back our Jewish brothers who have been sold to the nations, but you even sell your brothers. You even sell your brothers that they may be sold to us? You see, they were silent and could not find a word today. So I said, this thing that you are doing is not good. Ought you not walk in the fear of God to prevent the taunts of the nations, our enemies? Moreover, I and my brothers and my servants are lending them money and grain. Let us abandon this exacting of interest. Return to them this day their fields, their vineyards, their olive orchards, their houses, and the percentage of money, grain, wine, and oil that you have been exacting from them. And then they said, we will restore these and require nothing from them. We will do as you say. And I called the priests and made them swear to do as they had promised. I also shook out the fold of my garment and said, so may God shake out every man from his house, from his labor, who does not keep this promise. So may he be shaken out and emptied. And all of the assembly said, amen, and praised the Lord. And the people did as they had promised. What is Nehemiah saying to this people? He is angry, and he's essentially saying, you are undoing the work that we came to do. We have brought our brothers and sisters who were captives of another nation, and you put the people in a position that they could be captives yet again. We have brought people that were enslaved and in captivity of another country, and all you have done is made them captive within their country. What are you doing? But then not only does he say that this doesn't make sense logically what you're doing to the people, but he brings God into this. Walking in the fear of God is what protects us from our enemies. But follow with me here. Walking in the fear of God should not only speak to our protection from our enemies on the outside, but also influence how we love one another inside. I want to say that again. Our protection from enemies on the outside, yes, that should be what we should expect from God when we fear God, but also it should influence on how we love one another here. You see, they weren't doing anything illegal, but he calls them to return the land and the profit that they had made. Understand something. Think about if this is something that we called our brothers and sisters of Christ to do today. Yes, you made an honest buck. Yes, you did it legally. Please return it. Can you imagine people doing that today? Let's keep going. Nehemiah 5 verse 10. Moreover, I and my brothers, Nehemiah talking, I and my brothers and my servants are lending them money and grain. Let us abandon this exacting of interest. Return to them this very day their fields, their vineyards, their olive orchards, and their houses, and the percentage of money, grain, wine, and oil that you have been exacting from them. You see, they were doing what was in their legal right. According to society and legal standards, they were in the clear. You see, from that lens, they were good at business. But just because it meets social and cultural standards, that does not mean that it lives up to God's standards. You see, ultimately, the standards of a holy God outweigh those of a broken world. I'm going to say that so that we get this. This is really what we're talking about today. The standards of a holy God outweigh those of a broken world. And understand something. Yes, our God is holy, but yes, the world that we live in today is broken. So what does he ask them to do? Stop exacting interest. Give back the profits that you have made off of them. You see, what we take away from this isn't that we shouldn't do business with other believers or to expect an unfair discount because of our faith. You see, this should influence us to help where we can and not to abuse each other based on our familiarity. You know, I was thinking when we were going through this, I was thinking of 1 Corinthians chapter 8, verse 8. Food will not commend us to God. We are no worse off if we do not eat and no better off if we do. But listen to this, what the Apostle Paul says. But take care that this right of yours does not somehow become a stumbling block to the weak. Isn't that what Nehemiah is accusing them of? Yes, you are exercising your rights, your legal ability, but you doing that is causing a stumbling block for your brothers and sisters. Do not, I'm going to read that again. Take care that this right, this entitlement of yours does not somehow become a stumbling block to the weak. You know, I feel like what the Apostle Paul is telling us in Corinthians and what we see Nehemiah doing in the book of Nehemiah goes against the mindset of the culture that we live in. Right? Like how many arguments do we see about people saying, you know, this is my right. Don't take away my right. Don't tell me what to do. What do we see the Apostle Paul saying here? What do we see Nehemiah doing? Hey, exercise your rights. Don't let it become a stumbling block. Don't let it become something that hurts your weaker brothers. But this is what's amazing to me. Are you ready? This is going to blow your mind, hopefully, like it blew my mind. What did they do? They did it on their own. because they wanted to. Crazy, right? See, imagine if I were to get up here and I were to say to the congregation, you have been taking advantage of one another. So what I want you to do is I want you to sell back that land that you bought legally, and I want you to give back the profits that you made from them. You know what my expectation would be? That there would be some people in here who'd be like, you know what? You made a couple of good points. Let me mull it over a little bit. I'm going to go home. I'm going to talk with my family. We'll get back to you next week about what we're going to do. Is that what these people did? Not at all. What did they do? They said, okay. They gave back the profits that they made. They gave back the land that they made. They followed through with what they had promised, and the people did as they had promised. This is crazy. What happens after this? Well, we see Nehemiah lead by example. Chapter 5, verse 14. Moreover, from that time that I was appointed to be their governor in the land of Judah, from the 20th year to the 32nd year of Artaxerxes the king, 12 years, neither I nor my brothers ate the food allowance of the governor. We're going to go into that in a little bit. The former governors who were before me laid heavy burdens on the people and took from them for their daily ration 40 shekels of silver. Even their servants lorded it over the people, but I did not do so. Because of the fear of God, I also persevered in the work on this wall, and we acquired no land, and all my servants were gathered there for the work. Moreover, there were at my table 150 men, Jews and officials, besides those who came to us from the nations that were around us. Now, what was prepared at my expense for each day was an ox and 6 choice sheep and birds, and every 10 days all kinds of wine in abundance. Yet for all of this I did not demand the food allowance of the governor, because the service was too heavy on this people. Remember, for my good, oh my God, all that I have done for this people. What do we see happening here? We see him saying everything that he fed himself, everything that he fed the 150 men with him, he did it from his own expense, and he did not take advantage of the governor's allowance, the entitlement that he had. You see, they saw how the governors took advantage of their position. Even their servants took advantage of the people. We saw this earlier on in chapter 2, didn't we, with Sanballat and Tobiah? Their responsibility was to keep order in the land. Their responsibility was to keep this group of people safe and secure and not a headache for the king of Persia. But what did they do? On top of all of that, they took the perk of being a governor and they kept Israel low. They had abused the people of Israel, not because it was their job, but it was a perk of their job, because they hated this nation. These people were well acquainted with governors that took advantage of them. But he was telling his people to consider their brothers and to return the profit that they were making at their expense. But not only that, don't we wish that we had this in our leaders today? He was consistent and he led by example. You know, as I was reading this, I was thinking of a familiar story in the New Testament, that of Zacchaeus. We all know the song, I hope. I'm going to read Luke 19, verse 1. He entered Jericho and was passing through, and behold, there was a man named Zacchaeus. He was a chief tax collector, and he was rich. And he was seeking to see who Jesus was, but on the account of the crowd, he could not, because he was small in stature. Greg and I got this. We understand what it's like being small in stature. So he ran. I told him earlier this week that he was an example. I just didn't tell him what the example was. Sorry about that, Greg. So he ran on ahead and climbed up into a sycamore tree to see him, for he was about to pass that way. And when Jesus came to the place, he looked up and said, Zacchaeus, hurry and come down, for I must stay at your house today. So he hurried and came down and received him joyfully. And when they saw it, they all grumbled. He has gone in to be the guest of a man who is a sinner. And Zacchaeus stood and said to the Lord, Behold, Lord, the half of my goods I give to the poor. And if I have defrauded anyone of anything, I restore it fourfold. And Jesus said to him, Today salvation has come to this house, since he is also a son of Abraham. For the Son of Man came to seek and to save the lost. You see, this man, Zacchaeus, he was hated. He was a tax collector. He was very rich. But he heard that Christ was coming. So what does it say? He wanted to find out who this Christ was. And because he was short, he needed to climb up into a tree to get the view over the people. And as Jesus was passing through, what did he do? He stopped. He told Zacchaeus to come down, and Jesus chose to go into Zacchaeus' home that day. But the people were indignant. They grumbled. Man, Jesus is hanging out with this sinner. That's who we want to be the guest of, this sinner. But what's beautiful here is that Zacchaeus responds to the calling to a relationship with Christ by generosity with others. I will give back fourfold what I have defrauded anybody. I'm going to already give half of what I own to the poor. He wasn't saying that to the people. Did we catch that? He didn't say to the people, because of Jesus, I'm going to give you all of these things. No, he made that promise, that commitment to God. Like I said, he responded to a relationship with Christ by generosity. You see, Zacchaeus was within, I feel like I'm beating a dead horse here. Zacchaeus was within his right as a tax collector to collect that money. Zacchaeus was totally able to go and ask for really whatever amount of money he wanted from the people. Legally, he was able to do that. But like we said earlier, the standards of a holy God outweigh those of a broken world. You see, our relationship with Christ should propel our generosity with others, not license in how to treat them. You see, Nehemiah was sent by the king. Nehemiah had certain rights that he could exact on the people, just like Zacchaeus as a tax collector. Nehemiah could take taxes, or he could take the food that he wanted from these people with the authority of the king, but he chose not to. No, instead, he fed his people not out of the expense of the people, but out of his own expense. Why? Well, it's said there, because the service was too heavy on the people. Taking advantage or taking advantage of his right was just too much of a burden for the people that he loved. Before we end today, though, I think if we cut it off there, we could say that, man, Nehemiah was a great guy. Look at how awesome this guy is. He must have done this for the people. But understand something, he didn't do this for the people to love him or to enjoy the advantage of his station, but because he wanted favor with God. Let's look at that last verse, Nehemiah chapter 5, verse 19. Remember for my good who? Oh my God. All that I have done for this people. You see, he wasn't asking the people for their admiration, right? No. Who did he want favor with? Did he want favor with the people? No. Did he want to take advantage of all the things that he could have because of the right that he had? No. No. You see, he was consistent and generous. Why? Because he wanted favor with God. As a church, we don't talk about tithing. I don't want to preach a sermon just on giving because that should be something that we should want to do. You see, I know a lot of pastors that they'll preach either multiple sermons a year on tithing and what the Bible says about tithing. And other pastors, they want to dial that down a little bit, and they say, you know what, we're going to preach 1 week a year on tithing and 1 week a year on offering, and the difference between those two things. In a lot of churches, whether or not they preach a lot on it or a little, sometimes it can feel like all they want is your money. Or try to convince you to give. It's not the goal here, but when we come across a scripture like this, we want to apply it to our life. So here's a couple of questions I want us to walk away with today. Do we choose to give because we want the affirmation of others? Do we choose to keep and to take because of our entitlement or because we deserve it? Or what we have, are we willing to be generous with because we want to give back to God how He so richly blessed us? You know, at the church, there's ways to give, not only financially, but in time. We have kids ministry and we have youth ministries. We have life groups. We have greeters ministry. We have the soundboard. There's so many areas in the church. We, in a number of months, are going to have hundreds of people walk through this nativity. And Sarisa will find you, I promise. But you know what? I've realized in all of those service opportunities, guess what? It takes time. Time that could be spent doing other things. The question is this: are you willing to be generous with that time? If God has blessed you financially, are you willing to be generous with those blessings? If you're scraping by, are you willing to be generous with what you can give? You see, Nehemiah was, and he led by example. He called the people to do it, and he led by example. Are we willing to do the same? Every head bowed, every eye closed, no one looking around.